Hello everybody, and welcome to week 15 of Sociology 111, Introduction to Sociology. Today we're going to be covering chapter 20 of the textbook, which is the chapter on demography and an urban lifestyle. Next week, of course, will be the last week, and on Monday I'll be covering the final two chapters of the book, chapter 21 on collective behavior and chapter 22 on social change. Let me just make sure I'm right on those, because I believe it should be chapter 21, social policy or collective behavior and social movements, and chapter 22, social change in the global community. And that will be our last session for this semester. Today, of course, we're covering population, urbanization, and communities, chapter 20. I think I have that right. I'm not entirely positive. So, population, communities, and urbanization, chapter 20. Okay. Some of the things we're going to be looking at, we'll take a look at demography. We'll talk about what demography is. We'll examine some world population patterns. We'll take a look at fertility patterns in the United States of America and examine how those have changed. Take a look at population and migration. We'll look at how communities have changed during the Industrial Revolution. Examine urbanization as a phenomenon. Take a look at different types of communities. Look into rural areas and see how the population has been affected there. And finally, we'll look at social policy and communities, examine the phenomenon of shelters worldwide. Some of the questions we're going to be trying to answer during this session: how does rapid population growth contribute to the movement of large groups of people? Why have large cities grown at the expense of small villages in many parts of the world? Why are many residents of large and prosperous communities homeless, which is something that we look at here in the United States of America? So, real quickly, just a couple of new types of communities that have been, or a new type of community that's been springing up in the latter half of the 20th century would be referred to as an aerotropolis. Which is essentially kind of an urban community, a development that springs up around airports. And this is happening around airports in large urban environments, cities essentially all across the country. Some of the first development you might see happen there would be, of course, hotels and restaurants. But then these communities wind up popping up for support personnel of airport functions. So you have these urban communities now developing around airports, and the airport becomes the new center for these urban communities. Now, use the word community, what we're talking about is a spatial or political unit of social organization that gives people a sense of belonging. So when we talk about community, we're really talking about kind of geographic or maybe political boundaries where people feel they belong. Now, communities can be various sizes, of course, all the way up to the size of a nation state. Most people, when they hear the term community, tend to think more along the lines of neighborhoods, the people that live in the same area as you. So I mentioned that we're going to be taking a look at demography. Demography is simply the study of population. The Greek suffix graphy, G-R-A-P-H-Y, is kind of similar to the suffix ology. So you have ography and ology and science of and study of. So when we talk about demography, we're talking about the study of population. Of course, DEMO is a Greek prefix indicating something done of the population. So when we say demography, it's the study of population. Like democracy is government of the population, by the population kind of thing. So the study of population engages natural and social scientists. There are people with biology degrees in addition to psychology, sociology, social psychology, political science, economics, and anthropology. And all of these fields may contribute people who decide to specialize in the study of population. And so what we have when we look at this, fertility is one measure. There are 5 major factors when you talk about diagramming a population for growth purposes. There's fertility, which is incidence of birth. This is usually converted to crude birth incidence, which is the number of infants born per every 1,000 people in the population. Similarly, we have mortality, which is death in a particular society, and then the crude death rate, which is the number of people who die per 1,000 people in a population. Added to this, we have net migration, which is comprised of immigration, the number of people moving into your society to establish a permanent residence, minus emigration, which is the number of people leaving your society to establish a permanent residence in another society. And the final one would be infant mortality. And so essentially, infant mortality is similar to the crude death rate, but infant mortality is the number of infants, and that's defined as between 0 and 12 months of age, who die within that first year per 1,000 live births. So it's not per 1,000 people, it's per 1,000 live births in the population. And so what you have essentially is you have the crude birth rate plus immigration, the number of people who move into your society per 1,000 people, and then you would subtract the crude death rate, infant mortality rate, and emigration rate out of those. And this would give you an idea of how fast your population is growing, or maybe your population shrinking. In the United States of America, at the current point in time, fertility and mortality are pretty much equal. Our population only grows due to more people coming into our society, immigrating into our society, than there are people leaving it. But with regards to birth and death, we're fairly stable. Right now, Western Europe is actually losing about 0.1% of its population every year. Again, the birth rate and death rate are roughly the same, but there are more people leaving Europe. And when I say roughly the same, they are very close, but it's actually there are more people dying than being born in Europe at this point in time. So we have a greater number of people dying and leaving than we have being born and coming in. And so these 5 factors are how we analyze the growth rate of populations, and we look at whether they're rapidly growing, growing slowly, zero growth, or beginning to decline. And these 5 factors, crude birth rate, crude death rate, infant mortality, immigration, and emigration, form kind of the basis of demography. Now, there are a whole lot of other variables we can look at and other ways of categorizing population. We can break it down according to political affiliation, religious affiliation, gender, race and ethnicity, age. There's all kinds of ways that demographers look at population. The term graying of America, which if you remember from our chapter on aging and inequality, actually came about through demographic observation of the population. They figured out that the population was actually aging because fewer people were being born in the U.S. than had been happening in previous decades and centuries, Additionally, the average lifespan has been extended radically over the course of the 20th century, to the point where at the end of the 19th century, average age in the United States of America was not that old. It was somewhere around 35 to 40, actually about 35, and it's grown substantially to the point where the average age now is, I believe, 41, and is expected to continue to get older and older as people live longer and fewer people are born. So, Malthus was kind of the first demographer, and he gave us this idea of limited resources. Kind of the first person on a scientific basis to look at the idea of limited resources and how that would affect our population on a kind of planetary scale. And so he came up with this idea that in his still controversial essays on the principle of population, he came up with this idea that the population was growing more rapidly than the food supply, and that if we did not implement some type of population control, some type of population restriction, inevitably the human race would grow beyond the planet's ability to support us. Now, when Malthus was writing this, he published this in, I want to say, 1798, so this is fairly old. The year 1800 was the year we hit the first billion people in the world. 130 years later, in roughly 1930 or so, we hit the second billion. And between 1930 and 2015, we added 5 more billion people. We added 5 more billions to the world's population. Now, so Malthus has this idea that the world's population growth, because it expands exponentially and resources are limited, will eventually grow beyond the planet's ability to support us. There are people who oppose Malthus' thesis, and we'll get to Marx's response in just a bit here, but first I'd like to point out that there are some people philosophically who oppose Malthus's ideas on the basis of technological sophistication. Despite the fact that resources are limited, we continue to be able to extract more and more product out of the same amount of resources. One example of this is, when we think about grains, growing grains, in 1900 we would have gotten an average of 20 bushels of corn per acre, roughly, somewhere in that area. 115 years later, due to the application of technology and science and industry to agricultural production, we get 10 times that amount at least. We get between 200 and 250 bushels of corn per acre. So there is a school of thought philosophically that says regardless of how fast our population grows, inevitably our technological sophistication will keep pace and we'll be able to produce enough food for everybody. That's a philosophical position that ignores the fact that right now there are about 1 billion people in the world with food uncertainty. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Anyway, Malthus advocated population control. The program that China had, restricting birth to 1 child per couple, per family, is actually referred to as a Malthusian population policy because it's based upon the ideas of Thomas Robert Malthus, and he advocated for population control. Marx kind of opposes this because he essentially says that there's no special relationship between population and the supply of resources. What Marx feels is the problem is unequal distribution of resources. And he linked overpopulation to that. Marx saw inequality. Of course, remember, it's Marx we're talking about here. And Marx sees inequality at the root of almost all social ills. So when we talk about Marx's response, what Marx was essentially saying was he did not accept the Malthusian notion that rising world population rather than capitalism was the cause of social ills. Marx said if society were well ordered, increases in population would lead to greater wealth, not hunger and misery. You have to remember, though, Marx viewed any accumulation of wealth, any accumulation of resources by one individual almost as theft from the rest of the planet, from the rest of the people in the world. We still have some ideas around that Malthus kind of inspired. As I said, China's population control. India is looking into this neo-Malthusian view where we stress birth control and making birth control widely available. Of course, there are religious objections in many societies to that, our own being one of them. But neo-Malthusian view stresses birth control, access to birth control. As Jeffrey Sachs says, one way that we can control population is by making higher education available to a larger portion of the, the more women we can make education available to, the more we're going to reduce population, because as women get education, they realize they have options other than becoming somebody's husband. And of course, then the sensible use of resources as well. If we just, one thing that we could do here in the United States of America, if everybody decided to eat less meat. Meat is really dense food, and it's great food, for growth and for developing brain power and stuff like that, but it's very resource intensive. To take one cow from calf to slaughterhouse, and this is just one cow, takes approximately a barrel of oil, that's 75 gallons of oil, and 500 gallons of water. Imagine how much grain could be produced by those resources instead of just one cow. In the United States of America, we eat an average of 96 pounds of beef per year, and we eat an average of about 220 pounds of meat. Beef, pork, and chicken being the primary forms of that, but there's also seafood as well. Now, not all of these are as resource intensive as beef, but the more meat a population consumes, the more grain is needed and the more fuel is needed to produce the meat for that population. And at 220 pounds, we are eating way more meat than we need. The average 2,000 calorie diet requires about 4 ounces of protein, 4 ounces of meat per day. 2,500, 5 ounces of meat per day. Yet we regularly see this exceeded per meal. Think about like Outback Steakhouse's sirloin steak. That's an 11-ounce steak. That's enough meat for 2 people for an entire day, and it's usually being consumed by one person at one meal. So one of the ways that we could kind of distribute resources differently would be to reduce the amount of meat being consumed in high-income industrialized nations, and this would provide more food available to everybody. Okay, just a quick aside there. Moving on now. You may have heard of the census. The government, every few years or so, will try to count the entire population. Most of the time, when you see results of a survey, when you see results of a poll, what you're seeing is the results of sampling, random sampling being used to approximate the response of the entire population. There's 300 million people. Think about how many surveys and polls they do during political seasons and stuff like that. they're essentially just gathering from a percentage of the population, and the reason they try to do that randomly is because that gives you the best representation. A census is when you're not relying on survey or poll or random sampling. It's where you actually physically count every single person in the population. And what will happen is, in the United States of America, everybody who has an address will get census forms. If they don't fill them out during the years that they're doing the census, somebody will show up to try and gather the information in person from the residents of that household. But census is the enumeration or counting of everybody in the population. We also have vital statistics, and these can be gathered as sort of metadata as well. Birth records, death certificate, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, divorces. These are gathered through a registration system maintained by the government. This can also give us information. How do we know about the high divorce rate in the United States of America? Vital statistics will tell us that. If there's 100,000 marriages in a particular year and there's 50,000 divorces, well, then we know that divorce is 50%. The divorce rate is 50%, roughly. And so vital statistics and census also give us data. You can gain access to the government census data to do research with because it's public records. And demographers rely on vital statistics and census for a lot of their research. Okay, here's what we kind of went through a little bit already, the idea of these 5 major elements of demography. Crude birth rate, number of live births per 1,000 population in a given year. Beyond this, of course, we've got the total fertility rate, average number of children born alive to any woman. It's roughly 2 to 2.1 in our society. Assuming she conforms to current fertility rates, there's a different definition of fertility, which is just incidence of birth, the total number of births that happen in a particular population. So death rate, again, crude death rate is another term for that, the number of deaths per 1,000 people in the population. And then that mortality overall is the number of people who have died in a particular population. And then you got infant mortality rate. And I said this is the number of deaths of infants, infant being defined as between 0 and 12 months of age. So infants under a year of age per 1,000 live births in a given year. One I haven't mentioned yet, or I may have mentioned just in passing, the idea of life expectancy. The median number of years a person can be expected to live under current mortality conditions, current health conditions. In the United States of America, I want to say it's roughly it's between 72 and 77, and the reason there's such a broad range there is women live an average of 5 years longer than men in our society. It's one of the demographic bits of information that's kind of interesting in our society. Why do women live? There are a number of suggestions as to reasons why, but yeah, life expectancy. And then I talked about this, the population growth rate. It's net birth plus net immigration. So you take the number of births and you subtract the number of deaths. Then you take the number of immigrants and subtract the number of emigrants. And you add those two figures together, and that's what you get as the growth rate. How many people are being added to your population per year? The demographic transition is a phenomenon that happens when a society undergoes industrialization as a process, as they go from an agricultural, agrarian-based lifestyle to an industrial, manufacturing-based lifestyle. In agricultural and agrarian societies, you tend to have high rates of fertility and high rates of mortality. The birth rate and death rate both tend to be very high in pre-industrial societies. When you begin to undergo industrialization, there are three important factors that lower the death rate in a society. One is the application of science to medicine. You begin practicing medicine in a scientific fashion. This leads to better outcomes in healthcare. People stop dying so young, they start living longer. And so lifespan is increased. Another thing that happens is standards of personal hygiene tend to improve as well. People tend to bathe and shower and keep cleaner on a more frequent basis. And finally, the last thing that happens as you go through the industrialization process is that public sanitation improves. We begin to have things like underground sewer and sewage waste treatment plants so that we're not wandering through human filth all the time, which leads to very, very poor health outcomes. So these three things contribute to a decrease in mortality. But owing to, and we'll go through the stages here in a second, owing to what's referred to as culture lag, birth rates don't instantly drop when death rates drop. There's a period, culture lag is the period of adjustment where your non-material culture, your behaviors, your values, and your attitudes, and your beliefs, but here we're focusing kind of specifically on behaviors, the behavior of reproduction, your non-material culture has not adjusted to new material conditions. So we still have high birth rates, but we have low death rates. And so this is when we actually see fairly explosive population growth. So when we're in an agrarian lifestyle, before the industrialization process begins, this is what's referred to as the pre-transition stage. You have high birth rates and high death rates with little population growth. Then you have the early and late transition stage, or the early and late industrial stage. Transition stage, at the early part of it, the death rates begin to fall off fairly radically because of those three factors I mentioned. So declining death rates, high to medium fertility, so you still have high rates of birth. You have significant population growth. In the demographic transition, your population can actually expand really rapidly. And finally, you get to, as I said, this is a little simplified. There's actually the before industrialization, early industrialization, late industrialization, and post-industrialization. The post-transition stage, and this is where birth rates fall off as your non-material culture catches up to new material conditions. Your birth rates fall off, and so you are again back to a position where your low birth rates and low death rates, again with little population growth. Where we see the rapid expansion of population is when countries are undergoing the industrialization process, the transition stage. This is what's happening in China, this is what's happening in India. And as they begin to come out of this, we will see population stabilize. Most demographers, as I said, believe population is about going to stabilize roughly 2049, 2050, somewhere between 9 and 10 billion, 9.3 to 9.5 billion are the figures I usually hear. This is when enough of the world will have gone through the demographic transition that we will no longer have high population growth in a majority of the countries in the world. And one of the ways we can control population is by the industrialized wealthy nations helping the low-income pre-industrial nations go through this transition at a more rapid rate. Jeffrey Sachs believes that education for women can play a key role in reducing the period of demographic transition. So it reduces that period where you have that rapid population growth. Staggering increases in world population during the 20th century. As I mentioned, in the year 1800, it took us up until 1800 to achieve the first billion people. Another 130 years to achieve the next billion people. And then in the intervening 85 years between 1930 and 2015, we added 5 more billions to our population, which is substantial population growth. I believe at this point in time, the doubling rate of the planet, the rate at which population growth doubles every time, is somewhere around 35 to 40 years. Okay, but one of the ways we can examine this phenomenon is by what's called a population pyramid, and it's a special type of bar chart that shows distribution in population by gender and age. Now, the more it looks like a flattened triangle, the closer that population is to the agrarian pre-industrial lifestyle. The more it looks like a pyramid or a rectangle, your population pyramid, the more it is indicative of a population that has undergone the demographic transition, where you have low birth and low death rates. And one that looks like it might be, it looks like it bulges in parts where there are certain cohorts, age cohorts that are much, much larger, would be one that's in the middle of the demographic transition and is in that transition stage where they're experiencing population growth. And so by looking at population pyramids of various nations, we can see where the growth problems exist, because here in the United States of America, ours is fairly rectangular, and so we don't have growth, population growth as a problem in the U.S. In the last 4 decades, the U.S. and other industrial nations have passed through 2 patterns of population growth. High fertility and rapid growth, and then declining fertility and little growth, which is where we're at now. The population growth that the U.S. experiences at this point in time is owing to higher rates of immigration than emigration. With regards to fertility and mortality, we're roughly stable. We did have a period where our population kind of expanded largely after World War II, essentially between about 1945 and 1955. This is the generation referred to as the baby boomers, and this period of high fertility was referred to as the baby boom. The annual number of births rose dramatically after World War II. This wasn't all owing to people having larger families. It was actually average for single and childless families is about 10% of the population. That's actually increased over the last few years to roughly 17% of our population deciding never to have children, whether they're single or getting married. But in the period following the end of World War II, you saw a decrease in the number of childless marriages and one-child family and an increase in 2- and 3-child families. A lot of this was owing to the industrial machine that had produced all the weapons we needed during World War II now being turned over to manufacturing goods for the U.S. population. And so following on Henry Ford's model, of course, these new manufacturing industries wanted to pay their workers a high enough wage so that they could actually afford to buy their products. So high wages and general prosperity during the post-war period encouraged married couples to have more children and purchase homes, because we have much higher homeowner rates in the United States of America than you do in the majority of Europe. In Europe, it averages between 30 and 50%. In the United States of America, we're generally close to 70% of people owning their own home. And this was became part of the American dream following the end of World War II. Total fertility rates of the U.S. remain low for 3 decades, but the nation continues to grow in size. The reason for that is that we've had more immigration. We've had a lot of immigration from Latin America, from Asia, coming into the United States of America. When we reach zero population growth, this is where fertility, mortality, immigration, and emigration essentially is net zero sum. The number of births plus immigrants equals the number of deaths plus immigrants, so that every year your population essentially remains the same size. There's 28 countries right now, including 20 in Europe, according to most projections, that show a decline in population, where they're actually losing population. And as I said, by 2050, there's a school of thought in demography that believes that enough of the world will have gone through the demographic transition that will be at zero population growth. Our population will stabilize somewhere around 9.5 billion people. Okay, we've talked about fertility, we've talked about mortality, which is birth and death. Migration is another way that population can change in size. Migration is the idea that you're moving to a new state, a new nation, a new society to establish a new life. It's not just going, spending 5 months abroad hiking through Europe. That's not really what we're talking about here, because the idea is that even if you do that, you're going to come back to the U.S. It's the idea of moving to another country with the purpose of establishing a new residence and working in that other country and kind of establishing yourself there. So it's relatively permanent movement of people with the purpose of changing their place of residence. Now, there are push-pull factors that result in migration. There are economic factors, racial and religious bigotry that can force people to move. Dislike for prevailing political regimes. A lot of the Cuban Americans living in the United States currently fled the Castro regime when it came into power. And so we got a lot of immigration from Cuba. People looking for economic opportunities. A lot of the people who come up across from Mexico are unskilled laborers looking for the opportunity to make money. The early Puritans, who were some of the early founders of the United States of America, the colonies here, were fleeing religious persecution. When Hitler came to power, a lot of Jewish people fled, fleeing persecution there as well. So we have racial and religious bigotry that can cause this to happen as well. Desire to reunite one's family. Following the 1965 immigration reform, this happened for a number of people, a number of families, where the father had maybe come from China or from another country and had kind of established himself here. And in 1965, if part of the reform of immigration was that if you had a family member who had become a legal U.S. citizen, that created a pathway for the rest of your family to join them here. Now, international migration. Migration happens within countries all the time. People change locale of residence. We can move from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, and we have seen that kind of movement in population here. In the 1950s, many of the largest cities in the United States of America would have been along the Northeast, in the Rust Belt and the Northeastern Seaboard, Boston down to D.C., over to Chicago, really. In the 70s and 80s, we saw a huge migration of population leaving the Rust Belt and moving to the Sun Belt, which is Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. As newer technologies, information technologies and computer technologies, which don't rely on being placed in a certain area next to a steel refinery or coal mine or anything like that, made it more possible for these to relocate into nicer climates. But when we do this and we cross borders, national borders, then it's international migration. And this is a significant force in redistributing the world's population. Legal immigrants to the U.S. account for 50 to 60% of the nation's growth. In the last decade, this has become an issue with people seeing positives and negatives. There's a sizable population that has moved to Europe from the region of the world we call the Middle East, which is Northern Africa and Western Asia. And so immigration has become an issue throughout much of Europe. Part of this creates a phenomenon referred to as brain drain. When in the United States, we will welcome educated, skilled professionals and tradesmen from any country. It's much easier to get in here if you have a degree or you have a skill that the U.S. wants. However, if we think about doctors, and we think about doctors in India, many of us, when we go to the hospital, will see a doctor that's immigrated from another country. A large percentage of them seem to have come from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. These doctors would be much more valued in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. We don't really need more doctors here in the United States of America. And so this is a phenomenon referred to as brain drain. So, and international migration creates this problem for developing countries in Asia and Africa. Migration can happen internally as well. Generally, residents of a country are legally free to move from one locale to another. This is not always true, though. At times, in various nations, they have not been free to move. When we had slavery in the United States of America, African Americans, the slaves, were not free to move from place to place. And during Jim Crow, movement was discouraged. Apartheid, South Africa under apartheid, black residents were actually prohibited from moving from Bantu to Bantustan to Bantustan. They would have to have a passbook, and the passbook would have to be stamped by an official giving them permission to move from one place to another. Okay. Pre-industrial cities were much smaller. When we think of the term city, I mean, a pre-industrial city that was a large city would be smaller than South Bend. 50,000 people in a pre-industrial city was a pretty good population. So you had a few thousand people living within the borders. Pre-industrial cities, there wasn't a lot of social mobility. In general, in pre-industrial societies, people wound up working in whatever their parents did for work. If you were a serf, born of serf parents, you became a serf. If you were son of a blacksmith, you would become a blacksmith. So we saw this ascribed status on characteristics like family background and whatever the family traditionally did. The only people that received formal education, as in schooling, were the elites in society. A lot of them would receive education to become members of the priesthood if they were second, and third, and fourth sons of the nobility. There was a reliance on animal power, so the cities remained small. They didn't develop huge levels of surplus that we have, once we applied industry to agricultural production. So there were modest levels of surplus, but it had to be used fairly quickly because there were problems in transportation and storage of food, problems we don't face in our post-industrial society. We can buy a pound of ground beef, throw it in the freezer, and if it's sealed properly, 6 months later, it will still be good. And we have refrigerated transportation as well. Additionally, in agrarian societies, a lot of the jobs are actually on the land. And cities would be dangerous places for unskilled laborers to congregate. There were hardships of migration to the city. I mean, Chicago from Valparaiso, 45 minutes an hour in the car, right? And we may complain about traffic, but if you think about it, that's a short amount of time to make that kind of a trek. Imagine if you were having to do it on foot, or if you were having to do it in an ox-drawn cart. That could be a day or a 2-day trip. So migration to the city was more problematic. And as I said, dangers of city life. Cities are where you have accumulations and aggregations of population, so the people that prey on other parts of the population would aggregate in cities as well. Now, as we moved into industrial cities, from pre-industrial cities, we began to see a migration of people into the city because the jobs were beginning to move off of the land and into the factories. So they're more populous and complex than predecessors. And finally, post-industrial cities, where we have global finance and electric flow of information dominating the economy. And as you remember from the chapter on the economy, post-industrial cities, the nature of work changes, workforce changes. This is where we begin to see, like post-industrial cities, where we begin to see edge cities develop, and we begin to see suburbs develop as people leave the urban centers to move out where they have the chance to own their own home and things like that. Urbanism, which was a concept that Lewis Worth came up with, was the idea that living in a large urban environment substantially altered behaviors and leads to distinctive patterns of behavior. What Lewis Worth called urbanism, being more anonymous, being more self-reliant, not poking your nose into everybody's business. Some of these things Lewis Worth correlated with urbanism. And when I say self-reliant, it's not that people living in a rural environment are not able to rely on themselves, but there's more of a feeling of community, and the community comes together and helps everybody else out. And there's a sense of tradition and continuity there that you don't find in large environments. Self-reliance means, you know, that I don't necessarily get along with my neighbors. I take care of myself, but the way that I do that is through exchange in the marketplace. So it's become a central aspect of life in the U.S. Only about 2% of our population really lives what you could describe as a rural lifestyle. Because even living in Valparaiso, small, but it's an urban lifestyle. People in Valparaiso in general do one job and then provide for their needs through exchange in the market. In 1950, only New York and Tokyo had populations over 10 million. That's changed radically. There are 22 such areas, and New York and Tokyo are no longer the largest cities. Mexico City, with 28 million, is actually the largest city. By 2025, 10 years from now, there will be more than 30 kind of urban cities with populations over 10 million. Okay. Looking at our theoretical perspectives now, the first one we're going to examine here is this idea of functionalism. And this is where we get the urban ecology. Now, human ecology is the interrelationships between people and their spatial settings and physical environment. Urban ecology focuses that kind of the way that humans interact with an urban environment. So it focuses on relationships as they emerge in urban areas. And so from functionalism, how does behavior get affected by living in an urban environment, you know? And this is a functionalist orientation. The concentric zone theory, this was developed by Robert Park and Ernest Burgess, a couple of early sociologists in the early part of the 20th century at University of Chicago. And they developed this idea of concentric ring theory. There is one kind of downtown center city area. Think about the Loop in Chicago. This is where the most highly valued land in, and each zone as you move out in concentric circles contains other types of land which are valued different. You'll have some for residential, some for manufacturing, some for other purposes. You may have like a textile area and things like that. And then depending on what's going on there, the lands are valued differently. So the creation of the zones is a social process, and they saw this as the city kind of expanded out. It created these new concentric rings where each one is a zone. Now, one of the things that this doesn't look at is issues of gender, race, and class. There's phenomenon referred to as white flight, which is whereby the successful people who work downtown and tend to be white flee the urban center for suburban lifestyle, leaving behind neighborhoods of minorities which are trapped in poverty, and then that land becomes very devalued once it becomes blighted. The multiple nuclei theory looks at city development a little bit differently, and it says that it's not urban growth radiating out from a central district. Instead, you'll have like a business district, you'll have a shopping district, you'll have a residential district, you'll have a government, a banking district, all these different districts, and each one of these serves as its own nucleus. So the idea here is that a metropolitan area can have many centers of development. And suburban shopping malls are an example of multiple nuclei within metropolitan areas. A suburb develops, people live out there without access to stores, and eventually shopping stores and malls start to develop out there. And banking centers will as well. Edge cities are communities on the outskirts of major metropolitan areas that become economic and social centers with identities of their own. There are some edge cities that have developed in between Dallas and Fort Worth. Hurst, Euless, Bedford, for example, Grapevine, Southlake. These become economic and social centers all on their own. They began as suburbs of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but eventually became their own kind of city, incorporated cities. Okay. Moving from the functionalist perspective, where we get these idea of nuclei and edge cities, and we move on to conflict, where we've got this idea of the new urban sociology. And this considers the interplay of local, national, and worldwide forces and their effects on local spaces. This is where we get Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems analysis. He's got this idea of there's three segments that a nation can fall into, three different descriptors. And there's this core, which is where you find the high-income nations that are already industrialized, the semi-periphery, which is where developing and industrializing nations like China and India exist, and then you've got the periphery nations, and these are the undeveloped poor nations. And Wallerstein views what happens as the nations at the core continue to extract resources and exploit the periphery and semi-periphery nations. And when you have rapidly growing cities in these developing nations, they're a product of colonialism or neocolonialism, and they're only developed to the point where they can begin to provide resources for the high-income core nations and multinational corporations at this point in time, because let's face it, they are global players as well. If we think about the amount of money controlled by Walmart as a multinational corporation, There's roughly 178 nations, somewhere 180 nations in the world. Walmart has moves more capital and controls more capital than all but the 20 richest nations. I think they're tied with Belgium. So multinational corporations. But world systems analysis essentially looks at the relationship between developing nations, and the developed nations and multinational corporations as one in which the developed nations and multinational corporations exploit the developing nations for wealth and resources. Urban dwellers. Have you ever heard kind of this idea that New Yorkers are rude? It's really not true. New Yorkers are very friendly and very helpful. You just got to ask them for it. And if you are one of the people that's kind of holding up traffic, then you might see a not so nice side of them. But cities in the U.S. are destinations for immigrants from around the world. So we have a lot of ethnic enclaves that exist in urban environments as well. Herbert Gans was a sociologist who did a lot of work looking at an urban lifestyle. And he had 5 types of urban dwellers. Cosmopolites, these are the elites living on Park Avenue in Manhattan, that kind of thing. There's unmarried and childless people. The younger people who tend to gravitate towards artistic and cultural centers in urban environments. And so these are, think about the TV show How I Married Your Mother. The unmarried and childless people, that would be that group of friends right there. They're not exactly the elites, the people that can afford to live downtown regardless of kids and all that other stuff, but they're not any of the bottom 3. Ethnic villagers, these are the people who immigrate and then remain in ethnic enclaves and Chinatowns and Jewish enclaves, Serbian enclaves, various different types of ethnic villages. And then there's the deprived and the trapped, and these two kind of correlate with each other, although the deprived are people who live in economic deprivation, but may have work. They just don't really have enough work so that they can afford to move out of urban areas. The trapped are the people who don't have full-time work even, that may not even have any kind of work at all. So these are the 5 different types of urban dwellers that Gans identified in his work, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. So when we think about these groups, the cosmopolites and the unmarried and childless people are the people that choose to live in urban areas. The deprived and the trapped are people who would not choose to be there but are often left behind in areas of urban blight. And then ethnic villagers tend to be comprised of groups who have kind of resisted assimilation. So, issues facing cities, when we think about central cities. Crime, of course, pollution, of course, schools, suburban schools tend to be funded better than urban schools. A lot of this has to do with the local source of funding, which is property taxes. Inadequate transportation. If you don't have a car in LA, it's hard to get around, It's actually easier in East Coast cities than it is in West Coast cities. East Coast cities and Midwest cities, even if you think about Chicago. Chicago's got a pretty well-developed public transit, but the further west you get, the less you see of that. Kansas City's not quite as easy to get around with public transit. Suburbs, I've mentioned suburban. Suburb, it essentially is a community near a large urban environment. What makes suburbs different than urban environments or cities? They're less dense, private space, including private yards, and generally they tend to have more exacting building codes, which may include neighborhood associations, which are kind of residents decide like what kind of stuff you can do and can't do. It's the most dramatic population trend in the U.S. throughout the 20th century. Exploded following World War II. This is when we really begin to see a lot of suburban boom become evident following World War II. Mostly white middle class moved out of central cities. This is the phenomenon referred to as white flight. These were the people that were making money in central cities, but they took all that economic benefit with them. And what got left behind were the poverty-stricken people, including minorities. Suburban diversity tends to be much less. Although really in regards to age, household type, education level, and social class, suburbs and cities have similar levels of diversity. Race and ethnicity remain the most important factors distinguishing cities from suburbs. You see higher rates of racial and ethnic minorities in urban environments rather than suburban environments. Although the past 30 years have seen a diversification of suburbs in terms of race and ethnicity. Okay, finally, looking at rural areas, said 2% of our population live really kind of the farm lifestyle. That's maybe a little small. When we think about it, about 17% of the nation's population live outside a metropolitan area. But this varies. In California, it's less than 6% of the residents. In Vermont, more than 60% of the residents do. There's a lot of diversity in rural communities. There's farmers, ranchers, coal miners, gas stations along interstate highways. All these are part of rural lifestyles. You know, if you're living in a very, very small town, what my father used to refer to as wide spot, you know, wide spot where the highway widens out a little bit and there's just a few buildings there. If there's not a large urban environment around there, even if you're running a gas station, you're living a rural lifestyle. So, but yeah, about 70% of our population. They're ethnically and racially diverse as well. You do tend to find a little bit more homogeneity in rural communities than you do in urban communities. If you think about like going to school, that becomes problematic in rural areas. It's not uncommon for rural children to have an hour-and-a-half bus ride to get to school. And at most, you know, the average commute is about 26 minutes. So rural kids are actually spending more time going to school than urban workers spend driving to and from work, really. Methamphetamine has become a huge social problem in rural areas. It's springing up in rural communities all across the country. But when we think about rural areas facing problems first associated with central cities, overdevelopment, loss of land, stuff like that. Gangs have invaded the rural landscape. Drug trafficking, I just mentioned that. Methamphetamine is a huge problem in rural America. Poverty remains a problem. There's a lot of people living in a rural environment who almost live a subsistence level existence where, you know, between what they grow and everything else, they're not saving any money up. Post-industrial revolution has been unkind to rural areas. A lot of this, like creating large businesses, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Costco, can create their own different types of problems in these rural environments. Depopulation, as people move into the cities to look for work, they leave the rural areas behind. Economic stagnation. Price of food has remained fairly constant. Chicken ranchers, it's about $250,000 investment to build one of those giant industrial chicken coops. Chicken farmers make an average of $18,000 to $25,000 a year. That's stagnating wages. Talked about the large businesses hurting local merchants. If Walmart goes in general, Main Street businesses tend to fail then. Okay, and the final thing we're talking about here is shelter. Looking at what's going on. So when we begin looking at the policy, recent economic downturn created former homeowners who can no longer pay mortgages and who are now homeless. So this became very problematic. Housing problem means finding shelter of any kind that they can afford where anyone would reasonably wish to live. A lot of urban environments have like what are referred to as shanty towns. Shanties are just small shelters built out of cardboard boxes and shipping pallets. And this happens quite frequently. Like there's a shanty town in Rio de Janeiro. There's a small shanty town that exists on the western side of Ciudad Juarez, which is opposite El Paso. You find them all over Africa. So when we look at the issue, homelessness in industrialized and developing nations is kind of increasing and becoming a social problem. There's close to 750,000 people homeless on any given night in the U.S. Third world countries, rapid population growth outpaced expansion of housing by a wide margin. Oftentimes it's children who suffer this in third world countries. They will be left homeless and fending for themselves. Now, if we do an analysis of this, being homeless becomes a master status. It dominates every other status. Even if you have a job, if you're homeless, the fact that you have a job doesn't change that particular master status at all. So it functions as a master status with the stigma associated. So this is a stigmatized status. Individual remains outside of society. Right now, it's interesting. They tend to be a little bit younger, comparatively younger. It's growing faster than an increase in emergency food and shelter. And because I do advocacy work with homeless and shelters and things like that, I can tell you that here in Porter County, food pantries are closing because of a lack of funding, and the food pantries that remained become very, very stretched in resources. I serve on the advisory board of the Porter County Salvation Army, and we have seen a massive influx of people coming into our food pantry as other food pantries close down because they no longer have the funding to maintain any kind of food. So this becomes problematic. Another issue is gentrification. This is where low-income residents essentially are moved out so that nice new homes and businesses can be built, and so low-income residents get displaced by prosperous families and business firms, and gentrification then becomes a problem because they go in and, yes, it's true, they make the areas suffering urban blight look much nicer, but they price the rents and the homes out of the reach of the former residents. So that becomes problematic as well. So what do we do? Well, here in the United States of America, we have large, overcrowded, unhealthy shelters where, unfortunately, diseases can be spread because they're all just, there's no privacy in the individual rooms. This is an issue even in rural areas. Homelessness becomes an issue everywhere. Another organization I do a lot of work with and serve on the board of, Housing Opportunities, is actually an organization dedicated to trying to provide some low-income home alternatives for people, and our mission is to take people from homelessness to permanent stable housing. But it becomes problematic. And we take people from shelters and we have, but our facilities are always full. We don't have enough low-income, low-cost rent for all the people that need it here in Porter County. Another thing that's been happening, of course, is you see anti-vagrancy laws, things like that. This is essentially an attempt to criminalize being homeless. There's anti-homeless policies, no loitering policies, no vagrancy policies. Any kind of loitering or vagrancy laws are generally targeted at homeless populations. And so for the last 20 years, we've also seen them become even more stigmatized. It's not enough that they're stigmatized for being homeless. Now they're being given criminal credentials because of their homeless situation. And not everybody in our society sees it as a problem. Only 41% of Americans cite hunger and homelessness as a concern. More of us should see it as a concern. It's not part of the national consciousness for everybody. It's part of the national consciousness, but not an overriding concern. A lot of that has to do with our ideology. We believe that we live in a meritocracy where people achieve based on individual talents and effort. And so if somebody's homeless, there's an indictment on them there, a little bit of blaming the victim, because the reason they're homeless is because they didn't want to work hard and get an education and get a good job. So, okay. That concludes our lecture for today. Next week we will be covering chapters 21, Collective Behavior and Social Movements, and 22, Social Change in a Global Community. And that will be our last session for the spring semester.